Mi fa molto piacere avere qui con noi il professor Adam Tooze di Columbia University. Tooze è una delle personalità, direi, più importanti e più influenti sulla scena della storia internazionale, della storia economica, nel panorama storiografico mondiale di oggi. Ha scritto libri importanti sull'economia della Germania nazista, ha scritto un libro importante, molto importante sull'ordine globale dopo la Prima Guerra Mondiale, With the Luge, e il suo ultimo libro, il libro sulla crisi globale del 2008, ha avuto ampia diffusione, tradotto in molte lingue, anche in italiano, ed è stato molto discusso e dibattuto. Oggi il professor Tooze ci parlerà sul tema della egemonia americana, The Question of American Hegemony, a Historical Perspective. So Adam, thank you so much for being with us, and please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, thank you first of all for inviting me to this lovely occasion in these beautiful surroundings. Sorry, I can't help being distracted by my double alter ego up there. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's an occasion for me to continue a chain of reflection, which I'm sure everyone in the room is in one way or another engaged in, which is trying to make sense of the difference in the world that the presidency of Donald Trump makes, and how we locate this historically. Whether or not you're involved in contemporary history in the way that I am, I feel this is a matter of everyday concern. And it is an evolving set of questions for me, in part, of course, because really my preceding three books, The Crash, Deluge, and Wages of Destruction, have all had the question of American power at their heart. Indeed, even my first book on the history of economic statistics was, in a sense, a study of the diffusion of transatlantic forms of economic knowledge. So it's a question I just can't get away from, and I'm, of course, not the only one. The world is filled right now with opinion pieces questioning the role of American hegemony all over the world, whether it's in the Pacific, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's at home, whether it's in transatlantic relations. This question is posed over and over again. And I don't mean in this talk today, especially not in the company of a scholar of Gramsci as eminent as Silvio, to pose the question of hegemony in deeply theoretical terms, though I do think I have a sort of theoretical point to make. I want, in fact, to ask the question of how we reflect on this experience of crisis, because I do think it is undeniably an experience of crisis, as historians and where we locate it historically. For me, as a Germanist, originally a Germanist, somebody who grew up in Germany and is deeply shaped by a preoccupation with German politics, this image, which I assume was as widely circulated in Italy as it was everywhere else in the world, really shapes my understanding of this moment. And I think this is, broadly speaking, taken by the vast majority of people to be the image of common sense. Take Angela Merkel any way you like. You can criticize her, obviously, but nevertheless, common sense confronting the obstinate masculinist stupidity of American power at this moment. The fact that this was tweeted out by the German government itself, I think, is remarkable. It's all the more remarkable when, I don't know whether you've seen this, when you see other camera angles on this moment. So this is the image that the German government chose to tweet out. This is the image which the Canadian government chose to tweet out because it puts Justin Trudeau in the picture. This is the image which the British chose to tweet out because Theresa May is in there. And this is actually probably a more reasonable reconstruction of what happened, which is that two deadpan artists confronted each other across the table and somebody laughed first. That's actually, I think, the scenario. If you look at more images of this scene, it's a common drafting effort. The image the German government chose from its official Twitter account to put out was humiliating to the American president. And it's obviously a travesty of the actual situation, and those Germans present, if they were in fact in charge of the Twitter account, must have known it was a travesty. What this points to is not a matter of unfairness to Donald Trump, right? The point is that the Americans are losing control of the narrative, and even their closest allies are actually at this point feeding off the general sense of disillusionment with American power at this moment. And that seems to me to be really quite fundamental. But I think for historians, and without wanting to engage in the tiresome historian's business of saying, well, no, there's nothing new under the sun, it nevertheless poses for us the question of how novel this situation really is. When was, in fact, the golden age of American power and legitimacy? And since we're in the week of D-Day anniversaries, I think it's impossible to avoid an image like this. This is the moment in which American power, it is at its most legitimate. In bits of France, the ones which weren't murderously bombed by Britain and America immediately before D-Day, bits of France, as in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th week of June 1944 as they were liberated by America, and perhaps into August and September as they head towards Paris even more so. This is perhaps the maximum moment of American political legitimacy, when American power is literally welcomed with open arms. But we know, of course, that this was always answered by, it always had as its counterpoint, a critical undertow of a critique of American power. This case, this particularly vivid image, the dollar as a cudgel, wielded by a malevolent prince of American power, generated by American Marxists already in the 1920s. A critical oscillation, I want to suggest to you, is really the norm in our thinking about American power in the 20th and 21st centuries. And I want to associate that argument, and this is, as it were, if you like, the theoretical, insofar as it is theoretical, nub of my argument. I want to associate that oscillation with another diagnosis of the oscillatory nature of critique in modernity, that offered by Reinhard Koselleck in Kritik und Krise, his classic of the 1950s. Those of you who know the book will recognize the shorthand which I'm using here. For Koselleck, the state of crisis was itself a perpetual motion machine, if you like, endlessly generated by the dynamic of Enlightenment critique in modernity. He described modernity's basic condition as one of a state of permanent crisis. Crisis for him is the signature of the modern era. The elastic, this is a brilliant phrase, the elastic paradigm of the modern era. For Koselleck, because of its diagnostic and predictive meaning, the term crisis becomes the indicator of a new type of historical awareness. Now, we should, of course, thinking historiographically, situate this in Koselleck's own experience. He's a survivor of the Eastern Front. His brother was killed. He writes in extraordinarily passionate terms in the 1950s about his, and later about his experience at the end of the war. He is an acknowledged student of Heidegger and a disciple of Carl Schmitt. But what I want to suggest to you is that for Europe and Japan, since the beginning of the 20th century, America has been one of the names for this permanent state of crisis, this permanent state of thesis and antithesis, this elastic paradigm that Koselleck talks about. Let me just outline for you, lay out for you the exhausting series of oscillations which I have already sketched. One, I mean, think back to the beginning of the 20th century, the book that Deluge was preoccupied with this moment, the extraordinary effervescence of enthusiastic support for Wilson that you see in France here, but also in Italy, until the spring of 1919 at least. And then, of course, the great default, the great moment in which America quits on the project of creating world order. Carl Schmitt coins the phrase of America's absent presence in the international order of the 1920s, and it seems to me hard to find a better illustration of that precise logic. The missing, everyone can see the American space-sized shaped hole in the international order, and it is obstinately not there. The reconstruction then of the international economy in the 1920s under the sign of American power, under the sign of the dollar, and then again, the great American retreat, the true moment of isolationism in American history, the early 1930s, not the aftermath of World War I, where we see the devastating turn in the United States inwards towards massive protectionism. Offset in this dialectical movement by the resurrection of American leadership in international affairs in the 1940s, in the aftermath of World War II. All of these images familiar to us case by case, I want to just bring back to mind the relentless pounding quality of this oscillation all the way down to the present day. This image, for me, as a Germanist, one of the most remarkable, literally an advert for Douglas aircraft manufacturers. America's air power turned from the deliverer of death to Germany to the deliverer of milk to blonde little German girls. This is the Berlin airlift made into commercial advertising. And then, very resonant in the current moment, the moment of American agency in technocratic terms, the reconstruction of the global economic system at the Conference of Bretton Woods, the updated version of the gold standard, the anchoring of all the global currencies on gold, a moment of agency, collective agency in economic affairs so resonant that literally at the beginning of this year, it was made into the keynote for the Davos conference of January 2019, Klaus Schwab fantasizing into existence a post-war moment of collaboration. Bretton Woods, of course, a wartime conference literally weeks after Operation Bagration and D-Day, for a globalist German, a post-war conference that we need to resurrect in the current moment to restore order to international affairs. But also on the left, David Adler and Yanis Varoufakis in The Guardian invoking that same moment as the image of how order and coherence and governance is to be brought to global capitalism. A profoundly resonant image that sits, if you like, on both sides of the political spectrum as a touchstone for how we might think about how to go forward. And one, of course, which is indelibly associated with American power. And then the pendulum, of course, swings the other way into the dark politics of the Cold War, the great violent betrayals of American politics and principle from the 1950s onwards, both in the form of the narrative of Southeast Asia and Vietnam, the disaster of the derailment of American power, the endless search for the third force that never materializes between rampant capitalism and right-wing politics and communism on the other, that desperate search for some middle way which is never actually there. And then on the other hand, not to be ignored, in the history of European states, the minor betrayals, you might say, symbolized by this image here of John F. Kennedy arriving rather too late for the Federal Republic, months, indeed years after the erection of the wall in 1961, JFK on tour with the grizzled Adenauer, a man born in the age of Bismarck on the one hand, and the coming force of Willy Brandt, the charismatic mayor of Berlin, sitting side by side with JFK, the force of German reformist politics in the 1970s. This tension building up, unloading in 1971, in the first modern iteration of economic nationalism in the United States, with the Republican presidency of Richard Nixon, casting aside the structures created at Bretton Woods, that hallowed moment of coordination, casting them aside, famously blurting out onto the tapes that were carefully doctored in the summer of 1972, I don't give a bleep about the future of the Italian currency, of the lira. Let hell break loose if it suits the priorities of American economic policy at that moment. And then, inevitably, in this cycle, the restoration of American centrality to the economic system in the brutal unilateral decision by Volcker on the 6th of October 1979 to send interest rates across the Western world sky high. The entire conversation about declining interest rates that dominates the economic policy discussion right now is conditioned by the huge surge of interest rates across the Western world from 1979 onwards, which produced unprecedented monetary pressure on the global economic system from that moment forward. And from there, we go forward, if you like, to the restoration of a narrative of American leadership in the great moment of German unity on the balcony of the mayor's office in Berlin again, this time Bush, Gorbachev, and Helmut Kohl united as the fathers of a new, unified Europe. And then with a certain inevitability, we tumble forward as though constantly torn between hubris and nemesis into the new narrative. All of these stories produced by Americans themselves, critical of their own government, rogue nation, America unbowed, power trip, and once again, American power presented as the force of a cudgel. But you couldn't tell the story of the early 21st century entirely in terms of the Iraq War, as tempting as this might be, because we all know the other Americanized reality that we live within, because it's irresistibly seductive, the narrative of Silicon Valley and the shambolic, disinhibited, mobilized worlds which American technology has made available to all of us, and feeds off a different brand of Americanism, but with no less powerful effects in global affairs. And this, again, ties us in to a story of its own subversion, its own destabilization, because as you know, if you look at the back of an iPhone, it tells you two things. It was designed in California, and it was manufactured in China. And so this story of American power, of American capacity, dissolves itself through the increasing globalization of American economic activity at its core, and gives rise to another narrative, the narrative that drives forward to 2008. What Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary and great economic expert of the Democratic Party, referred to as the balance of financial terror, exemplified precisely by that fraught relationship between America as a booming source of economic growth and its dependence on China. Which gives rise to the headlines of 2008. Spiegel again, das Kapitalverbrechen, a pun on the words a capital crime, a death penalty crime, a crime of capital. The bullet not going into the American dollar, but coming out of the American dollar's forehead. And the nagging question, who was responsible for the financial crisis? All fingers in Europe in 2008 squarely pointed at the United States, because European banks couldn't possibly be responsible for this disaster. Clearly, it was unfettered American capital. It was feral American capitalism was responsible for this financial disaster. But if that was the case, who was responsible for saving the world? And once again, we're caught in this oscillation. This is why, if you talk to Americans, they will explain to you, if they're liberal Americans and they travel widely in Europe, it's really hard work to be American. Because you're, whether you like it or not, caught in this dialectic of the attribution of responsibility, the attribution of blame, and then the ascription of extraordinary powers of salvation to America, which in the crisis of 2008, following on from America's role in the stabilization of the world economy in the late 1990s, were personified by the figure of Ben Bernanke and the extraordinary activism of the Federal Reserve. Since this is the project that I was last engaged in, and the numbers, I think, are still worth showing at every opportunity that one gets to talk about it, what is it that underpinned that sense that Ben Bernanke was, in fact, the savior of the world economy? Well, it's these two slides. This is the disbursement, if you can just about see it, this is the disbursement of liquidity by the Federal Reserve System to the global banking system by name of bank. And the significant thing is not just the numbers, which at the bottom, these are billions, so the thousands are trillions of dollars, but the fact that of the names of the banks on the left-hand side, the top half are the usual suspects of the American banking system, and then all the names down from there are European. Not Italian, it's worth saying, but French, German, British, Benelux banks who are rescued by a huge injection of dollar liquidity into the banking system. Why is this so crucial? Because the dollar remains the currency, the fundamental currency of international finance, the fundamental organizing financial anchor, does dual purpose. It is on the one hand the currency of the United States, and on the other hand the global medium of payment and finance. And when this wasn't enough, when this huge injection of liquidity into the European banks through their offices in New York was not enough, what did America do? It turned the central banks of the world, the government banks of the world, into gigantic ATMs for dollars. This was a mechanism of providing further dollar liquidity, not directly by way of the banks in New York, not by way of the branch of Deutsche Bank on Wall Street, but by way of the central banks of Europe. And again, the numbers here are billions, and so the four-digit numbers are trillions. And what this is telling you is that the ECB obtained from the Federal Reserve over the course of the crisis $2.5 trillion worth in liquidity. These are not bailouts, because they're provided against collateral, but this enables the European banking system to continue functioning. And without it, I think all experts are agreed that the European banking system would have suffered a catastrophic collapse in the fall and the autumn of 2008. This two separate narratives that we have of the American Lehman Wall Street crisis of 2008 and the Eurozone crisis from 2010 onwards would have catastrophically imploded into a single crisis, spinning outwards from Frankfurt, London, and Paris, and Amsterdam, and Luxembourg in the fall of 2008. What the Federal Reserve's intervention does is to buffer that, such that the European banks survived the crisis largely intact. In Q&A afterwards, if you're interested, we can go into much greater detail about why this was as significant as it was. But the key point, as far as this narrative that I'm trying to give you here, about this extraordinary oscillation, this extraordinary unease in our relationship with American power that characterizes modernity, is again summarized by two remarkable magazine covers. Again, in this case, the same magazine. So on the left-hand side, on the left-hand side here, you have The Economist hyping the stories of the panic of the dollar in the fall of 2007. And here's The Economist 9 years later, the dollar restored as the absolute anchor of the global economy by 2016. But if you thought that, if you like, would buy America some peace, you would be naive, I think, about the relationship between American power, its functional significance for the functioning of the global economy, and the politics, not just of the transatlantic, but above all of the transatlantic relationship. Because as we all know, by 2013, the headlines are this again. The NSA scandal, the sense even that good stuff, these things, the iPhones, which are, if you like, one of the great legitimating devices of American capitalism, the history of the iPhone coincides precisely with the history of the financial crisis, as does the history of Facebook. The social media explosion coincides precisely with the history of the disintegration of Wall Street. Within 5 years, even that legitimating narrative is in question, both, and I think the significance here is both from the government side, both from the sense that the American state and its enormous technological capacities are an ominous and omnipotent threat to sovereignty, to individual freedom, but also significantly, and in a major new development, American private business, private tech, is also increasingly seen as a menace to freedom, to individual sovereignty, and indeed even to the sovereignty of states and to the functioning of our political systems. This is what I meant by arguing that America is, if you like, one of the phrases, one of the terms that we use to describe our profoundly conflicted relationship with the development of modern history. This is what I think legitimates the analogy to Koselleck's idea of modernity as a state of permanent crisis, as an elastic modernity that is constantly subject to deforming pressure, to deforming stress. And what I think makes America one of the ways in which the rest of the world, and I would specifically point here to Europe and Japan, one of the ways in which we talk about that uneasy relationship. Now, if you dig a little deeper into what Koselleck was talking about, I think there is reason to be a little uncomfortable with this analogy that I'm making. Fundamentally because Koselleck's diagnosis of this dialectic between secularization, enlightenment, critique, and crisis is, in a sense, deterministic. And it's a determinism that operates at a level of really idealism and state power in a fairly attenuated sense. Critique and Creaser, I think, is the book from the late 50s which embodies this, is in that sense a profoundly problematic text. And it's the one piece of Koselleck's work which most clearly is shaped by his encounter with Carl Schmitt. the depth of which will be revealed when the Briefwechsel, the exchange of letters between Koselleck and Schmidt, is published at the end of this year by Surkamp, which promises to reveal an extraordinarily tight, one that most people who've read Koselleck closely have always suspected, but this Briefwechsel apparently is like nothing anyone's ever seen before that hasn't been into the Koselleck archive. And in nominating America as one of the names for this elastic paradigm of the modern era, as one of the names for crisis, you could, I think, suspect me now of sliding similarly into a Schmittian mode of analysis. America was, for Schmitt, a catastrophic problem for the European state system, and indeed for European history as such. He belongs to a generation of German state thinkers of the state and politics whose experience was massively disrupted by World War I, and for whom this absent presence has to be read basically in malevolent terms. And in Schmidt's case, it allies with a certain anti-Semitism, which becomes more and more manifest in the 30s, 40s, and is maintained, and this is what is so disturbing about the depth of Koselleck's relationship with Schmitt, is maintained into the post-war period, in fact, blossoms in Schmidt's private writings in the post-war period. So to resist that, what I want to do is to try and put some more flesh in the second half of my talk. I want to put some more flesh on the bones of what it is, to me, makes America the problematic center, the problematic anchor of Europe, of power that it is. I want to move away from the rather overgeneralized mode in which both Koselleck and Schmitt approach this problem and address this question of American power more specifically, more historically specifically, more thematically specifically. And I want to address two key issues in the nature of American power and American influence in the world, which I think deserve perhaps more emphasis than they regularly obtain. And they fall under the very predictable rubrics of the nature of US capitalism and the very peculiar nature of American democratic politics. What do I mean by this? I don't want to, as it were, as I've just done, produce an extraordinarily rapid-fire account of the history of American capitalism as such, but let me just single out four of its properties, which make it, I think, on the one hand, an inevitable, on the other hand, a profoundly destabilizing anchor around which to base international order. The first is its sheer dynamism. Outside the Soviet Union, the most rapidly growing economic system the world had ever seen, all the way down to the present day, quite unlike either Europe and Japan, simultaneously economically and demographically dynamic. The population of the United States has tripled over the course of the last century, completely unlike the experience of any of the European states or unlike the experience of Japan. At the same time as per capita income has soared. The United States is also, in its own right, one of the most unstable economic systems in the world. The two greatest crises of the history of capitalism, the crisis of 1929 and the crisis of 2008, which, given the scale of the financial implosion that threatened in the fall of 2008, literally looked like the end of the world. Both of these trace their origins directly back to the internal logic of the American economy. So these are not crises. I am, as much as anyone, have argued for the European involvement in the American crisis of 2008. That is not to say that it was caused by Europe. It is the inherent dynamic of the American economy itself, which is subject to massive fluctuations. One way of capturing that is to look at the PE ratio, so the ratio between price and earnings of the stock market valuations in the United States. This is how much active speculators in the stock market, only one bit of the financial system, are willing to pay to gain slices of American profits. Those are the underlying earnings. And you can see that those oscillate to an extraordinary degree, with two massive peaks in 1929, and the other peak is not actually in 2008, it's in 2000 with the dot-com bubble. A third feature of American capitalism is it's continental in scale, and for profound historical reasons, I'll say something more in just a second, deeply regionally and socially heterogeneous. So Europeans point at countries like Italy and say, well, you've got the Mezzogiorno problem and this huge gap between the North and the South. The Germans endlessly repeat this mantra. Just look at the United States. Large capitalist systems like the US generate huge heterogeneity. And in the American case, this is compounded by a political and social system which tolerates levels of inequality which are unlike anywhere else in the capitalist system outside the periphery. The only comparable places are places like Brazil and South Africa. Now, you've all seen the Piketty graph, so I'm not going to put that up. But that is what the Piketty graph points to, this extraordinary willingness to absorb inequality. Combine that with a political system which is itself radical. I meant to have the background as a pop-up. It's not just radical, it's also astonishingly ancient. I haven't actually compiled a full list, but I believe the American Constitution right now is the oldest operative constitution anywhere in the world. That you could maybe make a claim for the Brits, if at this point the Brits have any claim to having a constitution at all. But the American one is surely the most important old constitution operational in the world. And it has certain very striking features. A massive commitment to the constitutional division of powers. Initially, and for most of America's history until the 20th century, until the middle of the 20th century, an incredibly weak executive. A politicized executive all the way down to the present day. A huge circulation of elites organized in political terms across the major business authorities of the United States state. A deep commitment on both sides of the political divide to an ideology of exceptionalism in the face of all evidence, and unresolved culture wars, many of which date back directly to the 18th century. It's a widely held misconception that Francis Fukuyama was talking about the United States when he talked about the end of history. Nothing could be further from the truth. America's not even a society where they agree on fundamental issues to do with religion or race. And that difference is really spectacularly relevant all the way down to the present day. Let me try and instantiate what I mean by this and the significance of this particular combination with a very brief sketch reading of the original crisis of American power in the early 20th century, the disaster of America's entry into World War I, Wilson's negotiation of the Versailles Peace Treaty, and its repudiation by Congress, followed by the disintegration, really, of the international order that the Americans have put in place. There is a deep-seated and obvious reason for reading this as first and foremost a political crisis of the American Constitution. It reflects a constitutional struggle between the Senate and the President for control of foreign policy. It represents a new type of ultra-partisanship. The election, the midterm election of 1918 is arguably the moment where for the first time the ideological lines of American politics are drawn in the 20th century. The Democrats are pilloried by the Republicans as Bolsheviks, pro-Bolsheviks, because they want to make peace in November 1918, and the Germans have made peace with the Soviets at Brest-Litovsk, and so the Republican Party for the first time can label its opponents as left-wing, as socialist and radical, and it reflects a profoundly weak federal government. The inability, really, of the bureaucracy of the United States to rally the political parties around a foreign policy agenda. What this account, as important as it is, and as much as it focuses on absolutely key elements of the weakness of American power at this moment, points to, and these themes resuscitate and return. The question of the Senate versus the presidency returns, for instance, in environmental policy. Kyoto, the Paris Agreement, have never obtained ratification by Congress. And there was very little prospect that Clinton, if she'd been elected, could have had Paris Agreement ratified by Congress. Kyoto, the Republicans never even attempted. In fact, neither did Clinton. There is a profound disconnect in America between executive branch policymaking and Congress. But this goes deeper than merely politics at the party political level. What was in question in 1918-1919 was the political economy of the United States, which had undergone a radical shift as a result of World War I. The Republicans are the party of low taxation. The Democrats are the party who fought the war, and the fiscal impact of the war you can see here. A huge surge in government expenditure in 1917, 18, 19, matched by, but only partially matched by, very rapidly rising income tax. The Americans fought World War I on a hugely progressive income tax. It's a strange feature of American taxation all the way down to the present day that it's rather progressive. It bites most on higher incomes. And during World War I, it bit incredibly powerfully on higher incomes. There is a huge push by the Republicans to regain control of power in the United States, because what they're struggling over is not just questions of international order, but questions of the domestic political economy of the United States. There are problems in the United States, just like those that we see in post-war Italy, in post-war France, in post-war Germany, of rapidly rising inflation, less severe than in Europe, but nevertheless for the Americans completely unprecedented. Here you see Uncle Sam struggling to somehow turn off the alarm clock, the booming alarm clock of the cost of living, which is producing strikes and strikes. And how do you do this? Well, you can impose government controls, you can scapegoat profiteers, and you can unleash, as the American business and state does, paramilitary repression of the American labor movement in 1919. Martial law declared in Gary, Indiana, the so-called Cossacks, in other words, the mounted police unleashed on the largely Polish mine workforce of Pennsylvania, for whom the Cossacks were a deep memory of their background in Poland. And here, Uncle Sam delivering a punishment beating to the rebellious labor movement. This is not the Biennio Rosso quite, but it is the logic of a post-war social escalation that shakes American society to its heart. The response is violent, the response is repressive, the suspension of civil liberties in large parts of the United States, and it is an absolutely almighty deflation by the Federal Reserve. The first use, the unilateral use of American Central Reserve power, the first Volcker shock is not in 1979, it's in 1920, as the Federal Reserve hikes interest rates to spectacular levels and unleashes the first great deflation. The world at this moment divides between Britain and the United States, which deflate, Germany, which hyperinflates, and countries like France and Italy, which mobilize whatever residual political authority they can to stabilize at the inflated post-war levels, a key element, obviously, in the backdrop to liberal backing for Mussolini in 1922, in the establishment of an authoritarian dictatorship capable of pulling through the stabilization in Italy. The effect of this, however, in America's profoundly divided society, in which you have, on the one hand, an industrial working class engaged in massive militancy, and on the other hand, an agrarian society in the South totally dependent on export and borrowing to sustain farm activity, is a huge upsurge in peasant resistance, a neo-populism, if you like, in the American South, echoes of the 1890s mobilization of American farm society, which unloads in the characteristic form of agrarian mobilization of the American South in the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan. This is Washington, D.C. in 1925. Now, we know there's no fascism in the United States, but we also know that if this was the history of a European country, that is the question that we would be posing. In 1926, the Democratic Party has, I think, to hold 120 rounds of the selection of their candidate for the presidential race, because the aim of the game is to exclude a Ku Klux Klan candidate from the Democratic Party race. The party of Woodrow Wilson, the party of reform, by the late 1920s, has in large part become the party of an insurgent, mobilized Southern electorate, mobilized in the openly racist, not just anti-black, but of course preeminently anti-black, but also anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish mobilization of the American countryside. And this is a key feature of American power. This is a story of American power in crisis. But the mobilization and manipulation of these forces that never go away, that are modified in various ways but don't simply disappear, is a key feature of American power when it works. And this is the point that my esteemed colleague at Columbia, Ira Katznelson, has made so powerfully in his book, Fear Itself, about the politics of the New Deal. An essential element of the New Deal of Woodrow Wilson that mobilized behind the New Deal in the United States and the Marshall Plan for Europe is locking in of the Solid South's racist white vote that mobilized in the 1920s in the form of the Ku Klux Klan behind a coalition which includes minorities and labor unions in the North and the great ethnic machine politics of cities like Chicago and Boston and New York, Irish, Polish, German, you name whatever ethnic constituency it needs to be mobilized. American politics, American power, even when it is exercised in the name of the good, if you like, is dirty in its roots. That is the nature of how power operates, like anywhere else. This is the crucial point to make. All the way down to 2008, a hugely underestimated element of the crisis of 2008 is the sheer political contingency of the conditions of possibility of the bailout. Because the Republican Party in 2008 first manifests the extraordinary symptoms that we're seeing in the Republican Party today. The Republican Party refuses to provide votes for their own presidency, the Bush presidency, to manage the stabilization of American capitalism at its moment of maximum crisis since 1929. They literally tell Hank Paulson as Treasury Secretary, as bona fide a representative of American business as you could possibly ask for, literally a former CEO of Goldman Sachs, don't count on us for votes. Don't count on us for votes, not for the bailout of Lehman. No politician is going to actively give votes for bailing out investment bankers. Don't count on us for votes for stabilizing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The institutions which stabilize the property ownership democracy of which America is so proud. This is regular people and how their mortgages are sustained. The Republicans are willing to put that in play. The entire crisis-fighting effort of Ben Bernanke, Hank Paulson is carried in 2008 by Nancy Pelosi and Senator Byrd, who represent at that moment a majority which the Democrats won in Congress in 2006 and sustains the crisis-fighting mobilization in the United States, warts and all, for better and worse, from 2008 all the way through to 2010, where the Democrats lose that majority. They pay the political price. The question, of course, that we have to ask is what happened to the Republicans. And this is, as it were, the key question of the present. And it hinges, I think, according to the diagnosis of most analysts of American politics at the present, on the breakdown of the so-called Southern strategy, of which I've illustrated the continuity here. The realization on the part of Republican strategists already in the late 1960s that the civil rights revolution, which fundamentally transformed the legal and political order of the South, or attempted to do so, handed to the Republicans, because the civil rights revolution was carried by Democrats, handed to the Republicans key elements of that New Deal coalition on which progressive policy had been based in the United States since the 1930s. And the mobilization of the resentful, white, above all, male vote of the American South, and increasingly also of the Rust Belt, the post-industrial zones of the United States, is the electoral cannon fodder, the political basis of the Republican Party in the United States, all the way down to the Trump election of 2016. That election holds. What is changed, and what changed in 2008, is the balance of power within the Republican coalition. Because in the first iteration of the Southern strategy, the vision was clearly to anchor and harness the white vote, the vote left orphaned by the Democrats' acceptance of the civil rights agenda, to harness that to a globalist business agenda, which became most clear in the Nafta deal of the early 1990s, a true bipartisan effort over the votes, both of right-wing Republicans and left-wing Democrats, shoved through by the Clinton administration at huge cost to Clinton in the early 90s. What we see in 2008 is that fragile coalition of elite business-orientated globalists in the Republican Party and their xenophobic nationalist base comes apart. And that really is the precondition for Trump's election. This image of Trump 2016 on the Confederate flag is extremely important because it is the reason why not a single corporation in the United States, no major corporation in the United States, was willing to sponsor the Republican Party's convention which nominated Trump in the summer of 2016. For a European, it's a little bit mind-blowing, but the Republican Party's Congress are generally corporate sponsorship deals. So Bank of America, if you hold it in Atlanta, will pay for the Republican Party to have its Congress. It's as straightforward as that. In 2016, the media advisors of every single major American corporation said, we fear that your corporate logo will appear next to a Confederate flag if you sponsor the Republican Convention of 2016. Not a single American corporation was willing to take that risk. The Chamber of Commerce of the United States, the leading representative of American business, refused to endorse the Trump presidency. Not a single member of the Council of Economic Advisors appointed by a previous Republican president was willing to endorse. Not one. The Wall Street Journal looked. They tried to find a single one. They couldn't find a single one. Hank Paulson, the last Treasury Secretary of the Republican Party, the man who had realized that he depended on the Democrats in 2008 to pursue the bailout, publicly endorsed Hillary Clinton and called on Republicans of good faith to vote for the other side, to vote against Trump. That's how profound this crisis of legitimacy within the Republican Party is. Now, the practice of power, of course, is something else. And when you have an American president issuing gigantic tax cuts, you have a fiduciary obligation as an American manager to your shareholders to sign up and say, yes, thank you very much. But if you have your choice of grand strategy, Trump is not your person. I don't want to go there, however. I want to finish by asking a blunter question, a simpler question. In light of this fractured, febrile, somewhat chaotic picture, contingent story I'm telling about the way in which American power is organized, the question I guess we have to face is, why does America remain so central? If this is the story we tell about the US, why are we so fixated on it? It has a soap opera dimension. It is the maddest and most important politics in the world, and so we all stare at it. But the more basic answer is power. And this, I think, is, as it were, the sort of dialectical conclusion, if there is such a thing, that I want to point to in this talk. There is the image of the perfect America, which is continuously disappointed. There is the internal logic of how power actually operates in the United States. And there is, if you like, the net effect in the world, which itself has a factual power that everyone else in the world has to reckon with, regardless of how haphazard, crazy its internal logic may at times appear, how anachronistic, how out of time. And this slide here is referring to this. I mean, for years, German historians, Japanese, Italian, Russian historians tortured themselves with this idea that somehow our politics was out of sync. You know, that the Germans would speak of the contemporaneity of the uncontemporaneous, the Gleichzeitigkeit des Ungleichzeitigen. This is a Bloch phrase, right? We would talk about, in Trotskyian terms, of combined and uneven development as the problem of the periphery. If it's a problem of the periphery, it's a problem of the United States in a massive way. It's deeply riven in precisely this form. But what we have to reckon with is the net effect. And let me just, in a few final slides, point to the reason why this net effect is as potent as it is. This is the slide which organizes the narrative of deluge and why this question of American power is essentially so inescapable. This is the throw weight of the American economy, the total GDP of the United States compared to all possible rivals. And the line that it crosses, the blue one is America soaring ahead. The line that it crosses in 1916 is the combined economic weight of the British Empire. Everything, the entire thing, including India, Canada, Australia, the whole works. At that point, America becomes the dominant force in global economic affairs. And it's not just in material terms, it's the dollar. This from 1924, an extraordinary image of the dollar god radiating outwards. It's an intangible, soft kind of a power, but if you're on the receiving end of it, you know how good things are. And if you're deprived of these dollars, all the way down to the present day, if you're Argentina or Turkey or European banks in 2008, literally your life breath leaves you in economic terms. Think about America's repeated ability, the force that lies behind all of that happy-go-lucky hipster tech is money, an extraordinary mobilization of venture capital. This is America's venture capital in blue compared to everyone else in the entire world. And you can see that only in recent years, since 2014, is there any rival to the gigantic flow that the American capital markets, the wealth of the super rich in the United States, can mobilize to hurl at new technology. And never underestimate the role of old technologies modified in America's power calculus. Hugely underestimated, I think, in the European vision of global power is the fracking revolution. If you ask Americans, especially on the right, what for them the testimony of the endless innovative power of the United States is, it's not California, because California is liberal and horrible and distasteful and full of slackers and hipsters and not anything they want to have to do with. But fracking, that's real men's money. That's Texas, that's the Roughnecks. And they have changed the world. And they have changed the world for good in this vision of the world because they have completely outflanked OPEC. OPEC has effectively no control over global oil prices because America has a decentralized, petty bourgeois energy revolution going on driven by free enterprise and free money, which means that as soon as the oil price touches $48, $50 per barrel, Texas floods with oil. So OPEC, Saudi Arabia's ability to hold the free world to ransom is a dead letter. And then, of course, the thing which dominates our reality, but in historical terms is a relatively recent shift, which is the emergence of the Americans as a full-spectrum, totally dominant military power. Probably, if you had to pick a historical moment, it's 1940. It's in the week after the Germans break through at Sedan, and you have FDR going to Congress asking for a huge navy, the peacetime draft, and a 60,000 aircraft Air Force, which America exceeds by 50% by the end of the war. At the time, Goering, at his most bonkers, would ask for 20,000 aircraft. This is 3 times as many. And why can America really realistically project this? Because it can provide them with the kerosene. Unlike Italy, unlike Germany, which can't keep their fleets mobilized in the Mediterranean by 41, 42 because they don't have fuel, the Americans have a limitless fuel with which to mobilize what Schmidt will refer to as this step into a new age of air power, this multi-dimensional, 3-dimensional power, which America commands ever since. And it is not boots on the ground that ever matter. It is airplanes and aircraft carriers and submarines and missiles which dominate that. And now the new world of ultrasonic jets and missiles, in which America right now is investing frantically. The reality, the hard reality behind the Trump administration is expressed in the Pentagon's budget. That's where you go if you want to see what's actually going on at the hardcore of American power. Unprecedented spending on high-tech, led by people straight out of the Boeing wing of the American military-industrial complex. Shanahan, the current interim defense secretary, literally spent his entire life at Boeing, now driving the whole thing along. So the reasonable question to ask, the fundamental question, in a sense, about American power is not, as it were, moments of crisis. Those are recurring. The question really is the persistence, the ability of this power structure to persist. Because this is the anchor. The persistent anxiety about hegemony, about legitimacy, about coherence is a storm endlessly performed, I would suggest, within a power structure that's in fact remarkably continuous and cumulative and tough and very difficult to shift or break. One place where there is a persistent set of questions going on about the resilience of American power is the group that I'm most interested in, which is economists. And there is, in fact, a live debate going on between 2 wings of the American economics profession. Gillian Tett summarized this very neatly recently, between a West Coast and an East Coast vision of the likelihood of the eternal hegemony of the dollar. On the one hand, you have historians out of Berkeley like Barry Eichengreen, who have a historical memory, if you like, of the sudden way in which monetary hegemony can shift, sterling to dollar, over the course of the interwar period, a matter of decades, very quick indeed. On the other hand, you have the East Coast faction, Geeta Gopinath, now chief economist at the IMF, and Carmen Reinhart of Reinhart and Rogoff at Harvard, who insist on the persistence of the American dollar all the way down to the present day. Remarkable persistence. It's increasing significance, as you can see here. The dollar is the bottom shade. That is the role of the dollar as an anchor for other currencies, increasing since the 1990s, not decreasing, in terms of its weight in the global economy. And this is a network phenomenon. And so until we come close to a critical threshold, the Berkeley West Coast story is very unlikely to unfold. This is the drama behind talk of economic sovereignty in Europe, the question of whether we can uncouple from the dollar, is the question being debated in America. No one, I think, takes seriously the euro as a potential counterpart or alternative to the United States dollar. What the true drama of our current moment is not, however, the recurrence of yet another moment of freak out about the way in which American power is organized and its internal coherence. What is truly dramatic in the current moment is the fact that we see the emergence of an alternative, and that alternative is, of course, China. What we face in the current moment is not a novelty in the sense that American power once more reveals the fragility of its political coherence, that we see nationalism, because in many respects what we see is a continuity of power. What the drama of the current moment is the very real prospect in historical terms of a power balance shift. And very dramatically, as I'll show in the final slide in just a second, the intensely sensitive way in which that finely balanced ecotope of American politics is responding to this, in a very, very live way. The drama can be shown like this. This is the Economist rendering of Angus Madison's data of GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms, or not, in fact, GDP, total GDP, not per capita, in purchasing power parity terms. One is literally the year of the birth of Christ. And then we move forward across the first millennium on the left-hand side. And then you see the drama of Western expansion really between the 1870s and the 1970s, that huge bulging of America and Europe, the decline of the dark brown bar, which in this case is China, and India, the salmon pink bar above that. This is a historically more realistic portrayal of the same data, which doesn't do the artificial trick of compressing the left-hand side. This is it century by century. If we put Jesus in, the whole thing would multiply out to the left-hand side. You can see the incredibly short time span that we're talking about, the rise and fall, or the rise and the supersession of the West, the supersession of Asia and its resurgence are, in the broader sweep of history, incredibly compressed events. Much shorter than the lifespan of a building like this, which is 400 or 500 years old. This is a story of 150 to 200 years, incredibly, incredibly compressed. And it tells an absolutely dramatic story for the American policymakers, because what this is pushing them to question, and you see it in so many different aspects of Washington politics right now, what that's pushing them to question is the basic theodicy, the basic assumption that the gods of economic growth are on the West's side. It is no longer compellingly obvious to American power brokers that this is true. And if it's not true, what is the appropriate response? The appropriate response is militancy. America isn't just breaking an international order. This is a liberal European misconception of the power game that's going on. America is involved in a bare knuckles effort to decide where power will actually lie. And what's extraordinary about the current moment is that they are willfully impacting the economic and the military. They are willfully impacting the dimension of security policy and commercial policy in a single monolith. So rather than playing the economic card as against the Soviet Union and expecting the military balance to fall into your lap, the Americans right now are playing both as a single vector against China. They are turning tech questions into security policy questions. Universities like Columbia are right now receiving blacklist emails. 3 weeks ago, I received an email nominating 14 universities in China, which if I was involved in sensitive research, I was no longer allowed to engage in free discourse with. They include Renmin University in Beijing. So we're not talking about marginal institutions. We're not talking about the Naval Academy of Science. We're talking about one of the most prestigious university institutions, not just in China, but in the world, which is being blacklisted by the Americans as an entity of concern to the American authorities. And what's absolutely extraordinary is that this is a bipartisan policy. This is what Chuck Schumer tweeted out to President Trump a few weeks ago now, on the matter of trade policy. The fear within the American policymaking establishment, believe it or not, is that Trump isn't serious enough, that Trump is just after a quick win. All Trump wants to do is do a deal with Beijing and walk away to the next election claiming he's the biggest trade negotiator of all time. The security policy establishment of the United States and the Democratic Party, this is Schumer, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, are tweeting out, publicly committing themselves to taking a hard line against China at the current moment. That's the kind of reconfiguration that's going on in this febrile ecotype of American politics. And this, I would argue, has a very new kind of quality to it, that it's very important for the rest of the world to be sensitive to, and it will force on Europe, whether it likes it or not the question of sovereignty or lack of it. This is a badly posed question, but it will force on Europe very fundamental choices about how it chooses to align itself with American politics. And no one should kid themselves in Europe that in the happy event of Donald Trump losing the next election, this problem is going to go away. Because at this point, this mobilization is a reconfiguration of American politics in this fundamentally political, fundamentally partisan, fundamentally constitutionally anchored mode, which is irresistible. Sanctions on Russia, likewise, will be authorized by Congress independently of the President of the United States against his better wishes, probably. Anyway, that's the panorama. That's my attempt at this moment to make sense of this. I look forward very much to hearing questions from you and how this looks from the Italian side, how it looks from the scholar here, what your perspective on this problem, I think, of common interest is. Thank you very much for your patience.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, for this powerful presentation. It's a presentation which poses a lot of questions in terms of history, first of all, but very much related to our present, which is one of the most interesting things, I would say. We have problems to connect our present with our past. Yes. In many ways, that's part of our engagement in global perspectives, in global history, and so on and so forth. Passo all'italiano, ci sono interventi, domande, questioni da porre, ce ne sono moltissime naturalmente, ma non voglio essere io il primo a porle. Prego.
Can you tell me your name and what you're attached to?
My name is Eduardo Barsotti, Fordham University. Thank you. Hi.
You're in Fordham?
Yeah, I'm
Excellent.
Fordham. Hi. Eduardo Barsotti, Fordham University. I'm maybe going a little bit out of topic, but I'm very curious, since you're a Germanist, what is your opinion about the US policymakers today on Germany? Yeah. Because, thank you.
Yeah. Obviously, yeah, I'll apply bit by bit. We'll see. You know, if we develop a lot of momentum, we can be more efficient. I've become acutely aware, because I really did spend the formative years of my youth in West Germany in the 70s and 80s. And I've become acutely aware of the way in which that shapes you. And I don't think there's anyone who feels the agony of sort of incomprehension more than the Germans at this moment. And you could say in part because their own history with the United States is rather different from that of many other places in the world. I mean, there aren't going to be a lot of people in, I don't know, the Dominican Republic or Guatemala who are going to be terribly disillusioned by the turn of American politics at this moment. Their conception of American power is not good. For Berlin, and I use these terms deliberately naively, for Berlin, in a really quite astonishingly naive way, the goodness of American power, the anchoring normative quality of American power has huge historical significance. Because it's a society 3 times remade by American power, the aftermath of World War I, after the aftermath of World War II, and then through German unification. Without the intervention of the Bush administration, it doesn't happen. And so the shock is huge. And it's difficult, therefore, I think also to come to actually answer your question, for them to explain how this is happening. What sense do they make of this derailment of what they take to be the natural and sensible order of things? And one answer, and there's plenty of evidence for it, is that the group of people around Trump, especially in the very early phases, are without question the least qualified, least educated, least knowledgeable, frankly ignorant, prejudiced group of policymakers that anyone, anywhere in the world has had to encounter. And it's an intensely masculinist administration. And so for somebody like Angela Merkel, this is a profoundly uncomfortable set of interactions, which have been widely documented and caught on camera, and one can only sympathize. I can also say that the Chancellor takes it with remarkable good humor. She does a fantastic impression of Donald Trump. If you ever have the chance to witness this, it's a remarkable thing. The other side to this, though, and you can see that I'm building up to a kind of a but, is that as much as there is that frankly kind of ignorant strain in Trumpian policy towards Europe and Germany in general, there is also a much more long-standing and skeptical and critical strain in the American policy establishment in both its key elements, both in the economic policy wing and in the security policy wing, towards Germany. And tensions in that arena did not begin with the Trump administration. They haunt, as I was suggesting with that picture of Adenauer and Kennedy, German-American relations really from the 60s onwards. Kissinger regarded Ostpolitik as a more or less disguised form of nationalism. The 2003 rupture over Iraq was profound, and the Bush administration struggled to establish viable relations with the Schroeder administration. And Obama and Merkel in the end emerge as rather key interlocutors, but the early phase of interaction between US policymakers and the Merkel administration is very bad. And on key issues of economic policy, relations between Germany and the US are in a state of Cold War, really, at least from the G20 of 2010 onwards, where the German finance minister Schäuble dismisses American economic policy as nonsense, as a source of instability in the world. And on the other side, the profound disillusionment of the Americans with Germany's non-contribution to the defense effort and the defense burden of NATO goes very deep. And it is, depending on your point of view, obvious why they would take that view. Germany, through the late 1980s, was a very significant contributor to NATO. Germany in the late 1980s was thought to have the third largest and most significant military in the world. It was a classic German military based around tank divisions, ready to fight World War III properly. 500,000 men under arms constantly, 1.3 million capable of mobilization. It's very important to understand this continuity. The Bundeswehr is the Wehrmacht reborn within the NATO under a different political sign. And then incredibly suddenly, from the early 1990s onwards, the Federal Republic just decides it doesn't have a security problem anymore. The change is on the German side, not the American side. And this change on the German side is radical. They've essentially reduced their military effectiveness to zero. They've abolished conscription. And they show absolutely no signs, despite the talk, given their economic growth, of actually increasing the share of government money, of GDP they spend on defense. And they're lamentably incapable of rising to major security policy challenges like the refugee crisis as a result. They don't have the hospital ships, they don't have the airlift capacity. Germany is not an actor for major global emergencies, totally out of proportion to its economic potential and its organizational and bureaucratic potential. And so this was voiced quietly and politely by the democratic administrations of Obama, but there is something shameful, it seems to me, about the way in which the Germans have jumped to attention in light of the brutish threats from Trump, when they refused that kind of reaction to Obama, who is somebody they ought to have been happy to do business with. And my advice to the Democrats is always, on any occasion, keep at it. Do not let up on this. Germany does not pull its weight. either on economic policy, where its conservatism produces a Eurozone surplus, which is completely unsustainable, nor in security policy in the broadest sense of the word. I'm not advocating the Germans building loads of panzer divisions. No one needs that. But for Germany to be essentially without helicopter airlift capacity in a world of massive climate challenges, for Germany not to be able to basically be relying on North Africa and Turkey, it's trivial. In a world in which we know that the Mediterranean is going to be a zone of crisis for a unified Europe, and Germany ought to be making a contribution proportional to its size. These are legitimate objections. And so that, I think, is the balance that one has to strike. And the problem, of course, is that the Trump stupidity, the violence, the blunt force nature of the criticism, the truly irrational elements, that he does regard Mercedes and Audis on Park Avenue as a threat to the American psyche. He genuinely prefers traveling in Cadillacs. I mean, it's a very strange person that has that preference, but he does. And most American politicians regard it as a curse, that they have to. For Trump, it's really So those elements overshadow what, in many ways, is a more rational set of objections. There's one at the back.
Thank you for your presentation. So a few years ago, a lot of people were saying that the coming world would be more and more multipolar, as opposing to the I would say Fukuyama's world of a unified liberal democratic perspective. But you depicted us more. I would say a bipolar world, which is China against the US. So what about intermediary powers like Russia, like India? For Brazil, it's a bit complicated because they are more or less pro-American now. But would you see for the next years a bipolarization of those intermediary powers with joining the one side or the other, or more an independent nexus? I don't know how to say it.
Could we have the slides back up? Can we make the PowerPoint come back? Thank you. This is an important graph in that respect. We are indeed, we're seeing, I think, we're seeing on the one hand the possible re-emergence of a bilateral superpower relationship. But then what I would want to do is I'd want to qualify that by a take on the global order that was itself differentiated, if you like, thematically, or by mode of power, or by dimension, right? So if you look at the world of manufacturing goods and trade, it's not a bipolar order, it's a multi-centered vision. If you look at the world of defense, increasingly it's taking on a multipolar, fragmented picture with China emerging as a true counterpart. And then what we see is our worlds of competition. And the most dangerous is the Gulf region, Indian Ocean, where you see very rapid acceleration in defense spending by Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, and then on the other side of the Indian Ocean, India, with a view to being able to compete with, or at least hold their own or defend their regional interests against incursion by either China or the United States. So we have, as it were, both a world, as it were, the pluralization of centers of power, but also a world of regionalization of power fields, where I think, say, Russia plays a very important role. Russia is not going to be a major player in the Indian Ocean in the way that China and the United States might claim to be. But in the Arctic region, which is emerging as a major zone of contestation, as we've seen in Western Asia, in other words, in Syria, in Turkey, in the Caucasus, Russia is a key player. And relatively modest means which are actually capable of being mobilized, unlike the resources of most of the Western members of NATO, which are just not deployable. If you have an army of 50,000 that's deployable with some naval capacity, some air capacity, and nuclear weapons as a backup, You're a major player in many regional conflicts. Russia isn't suddenly going to emerge as an arbiter of East Asian naval power politics, but in the immediate surrounding neighborhoods, it clearly already is and is causing a rearrangement. So I think I would want to allow both those dimensions, as it were, a multipolarity of power poles and also a fragmenting of regions of contestation where relatively small players, like the UAE, can emerge as a key player in Yemen politics, for instance. Because it can mobilize a powerful local air force, it can deploy special forces, and it's got the tens of billions which are necessary to fight a medium-sized war like that. It's never going to contest hegemony in the Indian Ocean, but it certainly can create a zone of influence which is very expensive, even for a very powerful outside player to enter into. And that's part of what the American military are juggling. And the basic diagnosis which the grand strategy of the Pentagon is currently following is to step back from all of those small regional conflicts so as to be able to focus on the global big picture. Because their basic premise is that there is a quantum leap in very high-tech weaponry about to happen in the next 10 years, and that is what they need to concentrate their resources in. Modernizing the nuclear arsenal by all means, but then you also need to be in these maneuverable hypersonic weapons, you need to be in AI, you need to be in satellite weaponry, and the distraction of the boots on the ground commitments to Afghanistan and Iraq is now widely blamed for distracting American attention from that game of planetary hegemony. Which is what the Americans play for when they're playing really big. So you see in an agency like the Pentagon an arbitration of these issues, and that is the logic behind their request to Germany to step up as a regional player. Right? That is why they want the Bundeswehr to be a more capable force, so that America doesn't have to be able to mobilize armored regiments for the deployment of the Baltic in the eventuality of a conflict with Russia. That is not the game America wants to be playing. And in the Gulf, they find very active collaborators who are very willing to take that on, buy the American weaponry, take the American guidance, and then fight their wars and their power struggles locally. For the Americans, of course, the problem is, does this create problems of delegation? Does this create problems of hijacking, where America will get sucked into a conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which I think is, below the China threshold. That's the issue which people in Washington are most preoccupied with. And there are factions within Washington pushing America towards activism there. The link to China is that the control of the oil ways out of the Gulf is critical for China's energy supply. And so the people who control that nexus are the people who can throttle China's energy growth. So that is in the mind of the national security planners, how those two things are linked. But this geometry is actively being negotiated. And the push on the American side, the big push, the big money, is towards this higher level of greater abstraction, if you like.
Hi, Michele Di Donato, University of Pisa. A broad and possibly banal question about the dialectics between agency and structure.
Yeah.
If you take other narratives of the transformation of American power, they stress very much this idea of global forces somehow disrupting the way US policymakers had come to understand their position in the world, their ability to intervene in the world. Thinking especially of Daniel Sargent's Superpower Transformed, with this idea of the 1970s as an era in which US foreign policymakers were kind of overwhelmed by what was going on and didn't really know how to react. Whereas, if I understood correctly, in your narrative, the state is still at the center of the stage. You're focused on the democratic politics of the US, of course, but also on US capitalism, which is not that territorialized as in other narratives.
Yeah. No, I think that's actually a great question, and I thank you for bringing Daniel Sargent's book up. So this is one of a brace of books that have appeared recently, focused on the 1970s as a moment both of the crisis of American power and its reinvention and its re-emergence as a driving and organizing force of world politics. The other book that one thinks of is Hal Brands' book. I can't remember the title right now, but it's in the same genre of writing about the 1970s. And I would agree with you that my narrative is different. It's in part because, to me, the force of those arguments is precisely that the 70s were exceptional for that reason. So they're exceptional precisely in that external forces buffet the United States to a degree which is really unusual. And a fuller account would have related those moments of external pressure and loss of control to the narrative which is more endogenous that you quite rightly saw in the talk that I was giving here. That's also my reading, for instance, of World War I. I mean, the story I gave you was really of the aftermath of World War I, but if you think about the run-up to that, Wilson's desperate, in the end, doomed effort to keep the United States out of World War I is another instance of America's struggle to maintain agency and its tendency in crucial moments also to lose it. So I sympathize entirely with that pushback. I think that's a good counterpoint. But in a sense, my story picks up again where they end. In other words, both Brands and Sargent are telling stories of the reconfiguration and reassertion of American power. And that's, I think, really what characterizes the last 40 years. It isn't really the continuation of that crisis. But as you were saying, really, to some sense, it's taming, it's recontainment. And the question really about China is whether it doesn't pose a challenge of a much more dramatic kind. So let me try and be a bit more concrete. What are the forces that challenged the United States in the 1970s? Part of it is clearly the impasse in the Vietnam War and the very dramatic way in which that is linked to domestic unrest and uncertainty within the United States. Part of it is the fiscal and monetary crisis, which America shares with many other capitalist democracies in this period. Part of it is, of course, the resilience of the Soviet Union, the fact that the communist threat in general, as perceived by American policymakers, has not gone away, but culminates in the late 1970s in the invasion of Afghanistan and collapse of the Shah's regime in Persia with Iran, which poses a radical threat to American grand strategy. And then there's the economic force, the force of structural change, which impacts America spectacularly at this moment, with the first wave of deindustrialization, the rise of Japan, which is really the moment, I think, in which there is a deep trauma to American economic policy making, which somebody like Trump carries all the way with him all the way down to the present day. And in terms of the domestic recomposition of the United States, the thing that both Brands and Sargent underestimate is that the great flow of Latino migration resumes in the mid-1960s and begins to gather steam on a huge scale in the 70s and begins to transform the demography of the United States in really quite radical ways. And I would agree with them that the story of the decades since then is really of a relatively successful, though extraordinarily lopsided, stabilization and containment of those multiple threats. At the military level, it's spectacular. So the recovery from the Vietnam trauma is dramatic from the 1980s onwards. And think one may about the outcome of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. They're not defeats in the simple sense that Vietnam was a defeat. They're moments of frustration and inability to make yourself to impose your will, but they're not straightforward defeats, humiliating withdrawals. And the drama of what we label neoliberalism is the containment of that domestic policy crisis by means of techniques of depoliticization, the reconfiguration of American party politics in the way I was sketching with the Republicans consolidating a new electoral bloc. So that moment of real, I think, Brands and Sargent are right to see it as a moment of real crisis, is one that is contained. And if you look across policy-making communities, the narrative they spin out of that is that of successful containment, restabilization, triumphalism, if you like. The triumph of the Cold War, the triumph of the great moderation in economic policy making, the reassertion of the autonomy of the central bank. That's precisely the optimism and confidence that they take into the early 21st century. And the current moment doesn't seem to me to poses quite fundamental challenges to those modes of triumphalism, but it doesn't challenge them in the sense the 70s did, right? So the American economic policy making narrative about 2008 is the one of triumph. They fixed it. Sure, they lost control for a second, and then they re-established control, and the American economy has grown since. Fracking happened. The tech revolution continued. The S&P 500 is higher than ever before. The Trump narrative, in a moderated form, is the narrative of American triumphalism in the economy. The Piketty story came, went, passed. The Democrats care about it. The Republicans don't. Wall Street has an ambiguous, and American business has an ambiguous relationship to it. China's emergence is no doubt a radical challenge, but precisely because it has the quality of the late Cold War and the re-emergence of Soviet military threat, it's also a familiar, insofar as it can be cast in those terms. It's an attractive and welcome return to a familiar story, a familiar challenge, which they think they can win in familiar terms. And I think that's where we're at right now, is as it were a testing of the triumphalist narrative of the overcoming of the 70s across a new dimension. The 2008 crisis didn't fundamentally disrupt it. I think China may be more fundamental because it constitutes this outside, and as I was trying to show with those epic historical graphs, truly historically dramatic shift. And the response by the Americans is agency, agency, agency. Yeah, it's screw the WTO, this is bare knuckles now, we're going to go at this hard. Chuck Schumer saying, yes, the only thing the Chinese understand is firmness and strength and power, right? The response is an assertion of agency. So this isn't, as it were, a structure, it's not read as a structural crisis, it's read as the emergence of a new contingent situation which America has to counter within a reassertion of agency. It's not a crisis of agency, it's by the way, the 70s were a crisis of agency. This isn't a crisis of agency, this is a crisis that requires agency. There's one at the front here.
Thanks. My name is Bruno Settis. We met some years ago in Paris. Yeah. And I would have a couple of questions. The first one would be on another popular narrative for the 70s, on the parable of American hegemony, on Charles Mayer's shift from the empire of production to the empire of consumption. Since you mentioned both the deindustrialization and the resilience of superproductive capacity, I would like to know what you think of it. Part of the problems being addressed by Charles Mayer was obviously the crisis of the labor movement. You made a very nice point on domestic unrest in 1919. I would like to know also your take on, well, the crisis of the American labor movement, at least. Well, one would like to ask a question on the labor movement in 2019, but that's obviously quite more difficult. But my very last question would be on Trump, so it's more political than historical. The kind of genealogy we've been taking on Trump is very interesting. Tracing Trump back to the Southern strategy and later to the change of balance inside the Grand Old Party is it's very interesting, and it's certainly part of the truth. But it's all the explanation we can have. Some kind of explosion of irrationalism caused maybe by the crisis, etc. But it's only this kind of populist backlash, or the fact that a rich businessman from New York has become the president of the United States against part of these very same elites he was a part of, he was socially a part of. Does it require maybe a social explanation? I think there are some nice, I think that Crashed makes some nice points on this, but does not really arrive in making some kind of social explanation of Trump's success. That may be also rooted in the failure of consolidating the allegiance of the labor movement to the Democratic Party, obviously. I don't know if it was clear enough. But
yeah, no, these are good questions. I mean, I don't, to be honest, much as I esteem Charles Mayer's work, I don't, to be honest, like this mode of categorizing epochs or formations in terms of, a single characteristic, empire of production, empire of consumption. There's a sort of, in Hayden White's terms, or in the analysis of rhetoric, it's this synecdoche, right, where one thing stands for the whole. The sails of the ships arriving over the horizon stand for the Greeks, America is production, and then America is consumption. I mean, this seems to me to be an unhelpful way of thinking historical periodization. I mean, I think what he's trying to get at, in part, is, of course, the role of the American economy in the world economy, in the sense that America's influence is increasingly being exercised through its trade deficit, which is part of what I guess you mean by talking about an empire of consumption. As America emerged from the World War II, where it had a gigantic trade surplus, it increasingly began to run trade deficits from the 60s onwards. And those turn out to exercise a huge power as well. So this is another way of exercising power. Whether this is the first time American consumption has exercised the power, I mean, you'd only have to look at the work of, say, Victoria de Grazia, my colleague at Columbia, to know that this is a completely unhelpful periodization. I mean, in the middle of what you'd think of as I don't need to tell you either, the epic period of Fordism, she shows the pervasive influence of the American standard of living as a conception across Europe. How does one classify Fordism? Is Fordism a politics of consumption or production? I mean, if you take a regulation school approach, this is a badly posed question, right? It's an integration of the two things together. So I'm not that I don't like. The force that it had for Mayer, however, is also that it provides an explanation for the major macro-historical shift. We were talking about this early on with regard to Italy, where across very different political and social formations, you can see a mode of economic modernity which is uniform and organized in some sense around major car factories. Again, I don't need to tell you. But the modularity of a Fiat plant in Turin and in Togliattiville in the Soviet Union is emblematic of this, right? And that model of production as a mode of power clearly begins to disintegrate. But to my mind, the idea that it's then replaced by consumption is completely wrong-headed. What it's replaced by is infinitely more complex models of production, which are tied up, of course, with increasingly omnivorous and gigantic levels of consumption. So the idea that, as it were, because the factory no longer is a very good emblem, or the car factory is a very good emblem for the organization of economic power in Western Europe and the United States, that we've moved from a realm of production to consumption is just, well, go look at Toyota. Go look at the proliferation of exactly those kind of capacities in places like South Korea. Chase the value chains around which that kind of production is now increasingly organized. Production still is, this is what I was talking to Silvio earlier, it's the deep truth of the environmental critique of the present is that it seizes on the reality that no, production is still going on. It's just displaced to places where the most talkative and most vocal people in the world can't see it. And we no longer celebrate it in gigantic monuments as the fascists, as the 50s and 60s still gratuitously did, celebrated Labour per se, walking around any Italian town, the Bank of Labour, the Labour office, as an emblem. All of this is gone, but it's a total misunderstanding, I think. So on the Labour movement, yeah, I mean, the shocking reality of the present is that last year, I believe, there was a level of strike activity in the United States so low that it defied measurement by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Literally, they didn't record any large-scale strikes in the United States in 2018. So the graph flatlines. And this is not true of America's history. The strike level in 1918, 1919, 1920 in the US compares directly with Italy or France or Germany or the United Kingdom. And the simple answer is that in this key respect, there is an absolutely dramatic break. And the 6th of October 1979 is not a bad moment to pick for that. The Volcker shock, if it impacts anybody, impacts the American manufacturing and export-orientated sector. Because what it does is to produce an overshooting of the American exchange rate. Sterling does the same thing under Thatcher. The pound and the dollar surge, and so you have this lethal combination of high interest rates, which make financing business difficult, surging exchange rate, which makes exports very difficult, and imports incredibly cheap at a moment when Japan is poised to take advantage of that competitiveness shift. And it eviscerates the American labour movement as it does the British labour movement between the late 70s and the early 80s. And what you see in response to that on the part of strategically thinking democratic activists and businessmen looking for a new political base, like Robert Rubin, is the reconfiguration of the Democratic Party around a triple affiliation, a residual commitment to organised labour, which you carry along and assume you're going to win those votes, a social and cultural liberalism that is going to prioritise rights for the onward and progressive pursuit of rights for women, gay rights, the agenda of human rights radicalized to the United States. And the third element, however, will be a globalized business agenda that Rubin and that configuration of figures in the Time magazine cover of 1999 very neatly encapsulate. And that leaves precious little space for organized labor. Nafta is the last big struggle of American organized labor and its last big defeat. Because the organized labor movement lined up against Nafta, and the Clinton administration did it anyway and worked hand in glove with the Republican elite to push it through. How do we read Trump? Is my analysis in terms of, if you like, kind of a class coalition through the Republican Party complete? No, obviously not. For the purposes of trying to get at broad dimensions of political economy, it's an approximate solution, which I think, and the point that is important to me is to stress the depth of the alienation between the Trump agenda and the business elite of the United States. And on that point, I would depart from what you said, where you said, well, he's a rich businessman and he's elected president, and so what's going on there? And I think you even said, so he's part of this elite. And the answer is, I think, no, he's not at all. And this is where we need to be more precise in our analysis of the composition of the American moneyed elite. And Trump belongs to a bit which is rich, sure, though how rich we don't really know. But how he gets rich is absolutely crucial. And this is not highbrow, complex, corporate American capitalism. So this is not the old money, GE, IBM. It's not that kind of or Exxon. It's not sophisticated mega corporation money. Nor is it tech. Nor is it oil. Nor is it the brilliance, frankly, of the financial engineering crew in consulting and investment banking. This is low-level machine business in one or two urban centers of the United States, literally mobbed up when it operates in New Jersey. You can't do construction in New York without having a relationship with the mob. It's just not possible to do it. And there's overwhelming evidence that Trump had and maintained long-standing relations with the mafia in New Jersey. You can't operate casinos there without having that sort of relationship. No, he does not belong. He was never part of polite society. He belongs to the party scene, the social scene of New York of the 1980s and 1990s. And in some ways, he seems to me, and I would agree with you, he's the sort of repressed unconscious of that party scene. He behaves and speaks the way men of that generation used to until they married sophisticated women, developed the habit of going to Davos, had human relations departments in their corporations, and realized that this was a terrible way to carry on. And Trump is still living the 1980s disinhibited party scene. But that's precisely because he is the sort of businessman that he is. And he is not somebody who's had to run an Exxon or a Goldman Sachs, where you can't do that. You know, it just is not actually an operative mode for those kind of organizations. And that gives him this, plus you have to add the televisual dimension. So he has the same oscillating quality, we were talking about this over lunch, at a much more primitive level as Silvio Berlusconi. I mean, Silvio Berlusconi is the real originator, the truly creative, genuinely dynamic and innovative business figure. Trump is a character out of one of Berlusconi's shows, like projected onto the big stage by way of the operation of this media machine. And his policies are kind of an echo of that, right? I mean, he carries with him undigested fragments of the first Latino migration wave of the 70s and 80s, the violent racial politics of New York in the 1980s. This is a man who put an advert in the New York Times calling for the execution of a group of young black men falsely accused of a rape in Central Park, literally calling for their execution, spending his own money, right? And somebody who has still not gotten over the Japan shock of the 70s and 80s, and there are these recurring elements that just run through. So yeah, all of this complexity you would need to understand the Trump phenomenon and to place it, and then an amazingly erratic, dynamic, unpredictable power play at work in the camarilla around Trump ever since he took office, a constantly shifting field with all the unpredictable qualities that we expect from princely politics of that type. Who's closest to the prince? Who flatters him most effectively? We're in that kind of world of indeterminacy. And most of the predictions of those who thought the adults in the room were going to rein him back in again have proven in vain, right? Most of the adults have departed the scene. That doesn't mean that there isn't adult power politics being pursued, but it's often detached from Trump, or it's absorbed some radical elements of his agenda and therefore has a dynamic that he will then tolerate. All of this would be necessary to give some fuller account. But that key element of a rupture in a class, ethnic, regional, gendered, coalitional politics of the Republican Party, I would insist upon as, without that, nothing else. After that, sure, there is this massive tangled complexity that you'd have to reckon with.
Yes, another question. Could you tell us more about American current account deficits, which seem to me a bit paradoxical, because they are at the same time the sign of American power and of American weakness.
Yes.
So on the other hand, it's thanks to the dollar and the might of the dollars, and can run constantly on a current account deficit and live at the expense of the world. And on the other side, they are exactly what Trump want to diminish, and is reasoning in a basic way of current account deficit with a country is bad, and having an excellent is good. So what about that?
Well, this is one thing on which Trump and the Germans agree. Right, that primitivism is, after all, not limited to Trump. That primitivism is commonplace in European economic discourse as well. It's one of the great besetting sins of neoliberalism, as it was never really all that serious about its globalism. Because if you were a radical globalist, you would deny the logic of national competitiveness. You'd say it made no sense. They could never really abandon that. I mean, all the way back in the late 1990s, Paul Krugman was pillorying the Clinton administration for indulging in this nonsense about national competitiveness. It doesn't make any sense from the point of view of macroeconomics. So Trump is as, again, he's kind of the id of that discourse, to my mind. He's flashing back. If global neoliberalism had been serious about really excising economic nationalism, it would not have used national competitiveness as a whip to force through programs of reform here, there, and everywhere, including, of course, in this country. And it's very difficult to persuade Germans that competitiveness might not be Italy's problem. I mean, on their own metric, you have a trade surplus. What could possibly be wrong? You've had a trade surplus all along. That isn't Italy's problem, right? The national competitiveness discourse is a profoundly, it's a meme, it's a virus, a bad thought meme that runs through economic policy discourse, and Trump has no monopoly of it. But your question is more serious than that. How do we read this? And it goes back to the question about empires of production and empires of consumption. I think let me put two sides to it. There is a strand of reasonable economic policy discourse and criticism all the way back to the 80s in the US, which is an industrial policy discourse, and which is deeply wedded to the idea that the loss of blue-collar manufacturing jobs is profoundly destructive of whatever norms of social cohesion the analyst is advocating. So there's this idea that if you lose those, they use this ungrammatical phrase, good-paying jobs, then middle-class society, it's a really chaotic, in sociological terms, discourse. The loss of good-paying blue-collar jobs will lead to a collapse of middle-class America. And this is at the foundation of the unsettlement of not just the American economy, but of American society. It's again, a kind of Baudelarized, poor way of talking about the inequality problem that Piketty's data highlight with kind of razor precision. The question, of course, one understands where that logic came from. The American welfare state was built like the communist welfare state on corporations. There was an iron breadbasket, basically, an iron rice bowl. And it was based on the Treaty of Detroit in the aftermath of World War II. And so as those corporations collapsed, and the welfare obligations that they have are a big flywheel on their collapse, it does indeed undo an entire structure of American social life, in the same way as the diminishment of fiat has changed Turin, right? This is a huge general dynamic. The question, of course, is whether there's any conceivable alternative, and whether or not a progressive and a dynamic policy doesn't have to adjust to this creatively, think through the implications and the emancipatory potential people. We all know that. We all know the discourse. So that's one side of this critique of current account deficit, that America has somehow lost its preeminence in those areas. And there's the security policy dimension, which is coming ever more to the fore, which is that deep down there's some sense that unless you can make things, you're not somehow prepared for conflict. And again, the mind boggles. What kind of a conflict would it be in which the capacity to make motor cars is irrelevant one way or the other? It's really some sort of deep echo of the Korean War or perhaps Vietnam, but it's very difficult to place that in rational terms. As far as America's actual experience of vulnerability from current accounts goes, again, there is an interesting history, in the sense that Volcker implemented the policy that he did because there was a real sense in the late 70s that dollar hegemony was slipping and it had to be restored. It was an acute sense of crisis, that the dollar was really going down the tubes. America's inflation rate was almost 20%. Something had to be done about it. As late as the Clinton administration, in the first year of the Clinton administration, as we know from the memoirs of insiders, there was real anxiety about so-called bond vigilante pressure on the American government, with people selling American government bonds, driving interest rates up, crashing the dollar and causing a major crisis, an emerging market, Italian, British-style crisis of the 70s in America. In fact, an Italian crisis like 92 in the United States in 92, 93. What's astonishing about the near 20 years since then is how completely that threat as a reality has disappeared. Nothing America does appears to shake the willingness of bond markets to buy its debt. And so there has been a complete reevaluation, I think, and this goes to the force of your question, of this supposed vulnerability in terms of an analysis of America as an incredibly powerful debtor, as the most powerful debtor in the world. You know, following the Keynesian quip, if I owe the bank £1,000, I've got a problem. If I owe the bank £1 million, the bank's got a problem. In this case, America is the anchor of the issuance of what have now even been recoded as safe assets. So the analysis now is not, as it were, can America raise capital market funds to subsidize its deficits, but where will global savers go if America doesn't go on issuing AAA-rated government debt? Because they're not going to buy Japanese debt because that's exotic and different, and they're not going to buy Chinese. And the Europeans, led by the Germans, have decided not to issue any debt anymore. Germany in particular is running down the available collection of debt. Now, Germany has quite a high savings rate. So what are German pensioners supposed to buy? They can't buy bunds because there aren't any. There's shrinking volume. Their price is going up all the time. Interest rates are negative. So you don't even earn anything if you do invest in them. The only AAA-rated, highly liquid, widely traded asset which actually generates a yield in the world are, believe it or not, UK treasuries and US treasuries. Which is why, despite Brexit, despite Trump, despite all the chaos, neither country has experienced a balance of payments crisis. Because there is a huge volume of global money, or even domestic money, in the American case recently, that needs to be invested in these safe assets. So this is the way in which this entire discourse has been repolarized. And it's very disorientating for a European left, I think, which has come to think about debt politics, and the entire fecundity and creativity of left critical theory has been devoted to debt politics modeled on the case of Greece, which is a completely anomalous, bizarre corner solution where you have a hostile central bank and other democracies as your leading creditors negotiating with you in a position of maximum vulnerability with your entire banking system on the line as well. And that is indeed a situation in which power relations between creditors and debtors are massively asymmetric and to the detriment of the borrower. And that is modeled in places like Argentina right now and in places like Turkey as well. But if you look at the total volume of public debt out there, if you look at the therefore typical case of a large public borrower, the typical case of a large democracy borrowing is not that story. The typical case is of large democracies being able to borrow at incredibly low interest rates on them in the main. And the question, of course, is there a threshold? And this is a painful question to pose in Italy, because Italy is precisely at the threshold where you tip from being a potent borrower, basically able to dictate terms to creditors who have to lend to somebody, which is America's position still, could be Germany's position, and being an enormous, too big to fail, too big to bail, third largest public debtor in the entire global government debt market, and balanced on a knife's edge in terms of the discourse of the Eurozone and the constraints that the Eurozone operates on. And Italy really is the liminal case. America so far has remained safely down in the other corner where the debt is not a threat. And this is hugely energizing for the American left and fundamental to the whole MMT debate, because they actually can quite realistically state that they don't believe that there's any fundamental limit to the capacity of the Federal Reserve to monetize deficits. The only real question is what level of employment do we want and what would we want to spend government money on? And in the context of the climate emergency, there's a compelling case for just going hell for leather. But that is conditioned on the fact that America is in this sweet spot of being a massive debtor with a huge global demand and a huge domestic demand for its debt. Interest rates on American government debt plunging as we speak, day by day.
Veca from Scuola Normale Superiore. Thank you for an interesting speech. My question is about, so your lecture was about macroeconomic and macro-military hegemony, but what about cultural hegemony? Only one time, if I rightly noted, you employed the expression soft power, only one time. So what about cultural hegemony in this elastic paradigm that you have addressed? Thank you.
No, I think that's an absolutely great question. I'm acutely aware of this. I mean, it's a limitation of almost all my work. And But I think and that isn't to say that I don't think the question is valid. I think it's very important. But so, in an amateurish way, let me sketch an answer to you. We have a certain amount of broad brush data. I'm in giving this answer, I'm sort of overshadowed by the fact that I am sitting next to a great Gramscian, and B, I have Vicky DeGrazia at home, who is the great expert on precisely the kind of microscopic reconstruction of the influence of American culture, of American consumerism on European. And once you've read that book, you are forever changed in the way in which you think about the way these sorts of things operate, very directly, sometimes incredibly indirectly in others. What we see if we resort to, again, macroscopic measures, though, of soft power. So if you use the Pew surveys, for instance, Pew Foundation, charitable foundation in the United States, deeply tied up with the democratic policymaking apparatus, surveys the world on all sorts of issues of cultural values, issues to do with religion, attitudes towards gay marriage, attitudes towards democracy, the rule of law, gender equality, LGBT rights, in an effort to map, as it were, this terrain. A little bit like the big values surveys they run out of Michigan that people like Habermas employed to map the emergence of post-materialist values and so on. And what those tell us about the position of the United States in the last 10, 20 years is really quite striking, in that there is a distinct loss of charisma on the part of America, its institutions, in large parts of the world, and a distinct emergence of China as a perceived other to the United States. And then large and rather surprising parts of the world where America's preeminence is completely unshaken. And one of the most remarkable is West Africa. So if you look across sub-Saharan West Africa, a part of the world which is racked by poverty, increasingly, of course, also by religious conflict with Islamic radicalism. In places like Nigeria, you see astonishingly positive, affirmative attitudes towards the United States, completely unshaken, as though nothing had happened. Really, really remarkable asymmetry. When it comes to specific issues, like gay rights, for instance, that harmony totally explodes. And this was one of the impasses of, say, Democratic Party foreign policy in Africa, in West Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Obama-Clinton eras, is that there was just a massive jarring, clashing of gears. And of course, the sinister story is that one shouldn't absolutely not present this as a sort of autochthonous, original African set of attitudes who are particularly uncoupled from global cultural flows and therefore slow to realize the decline of American legitimacy. On the contrary, Africa has become this playground for American cultural wars, with American evangelicals being the driving force, as in Latin America, of a massive evangelization drive which has substituted Baptist, basically right-wing American Baptist and prosperity gospel messages for either indigenous religions or Catholicism, or indeed even Islam in some parts of Africa. And they are fighting by proxy in Africa the cultural wars going on in the United States. I mean, an extraordinary kind of configuration. So this question of soft power, is very multidimensional, very, very dynamic. And the circulation, the patterns of circulation run in both directions. I mean, in the Anglican Church, there was even the astonishing phenomenon of conservative branches of the Anglican Church disassociating from their liberal American mothership and affiliating with conservative branches of the Anglican Church in Nigeria because its attitudes on gay rights was more to their taste than the attitude of the Anglican Church in California, right? So you have a kind of global game of norms being played out transatlantically in Africa. On another front, what's astonishingly interesting is the ultimate mechanism of American soft power, I mean, the classic mechanism of American soft power, Hollywood, is dramatically reorientating its vision. This, of course, again has history. I mean, if you read Wagner-Leitner, if you read sophisticated histories of Hollywood, I was just a year ago, I was in the Ferragamo Museum in Florence, and they had, I don't know whether any of you saw it here, they had a amazingly sophisticated cultural history display of the role of Italian craftsmen in the making of the grandest phase of Hollywood in the 1920s and 30s. Ferragamo himself spent time in the US developing the high fashion styles. So Hollywood has always been a cultural pro-production of the European imaginary and the American imaginary. But it nevertheless was one of the vehicles by which American soft power was then subsequently translated, and as it were, Europe's projection of its own fantasies onto America recurred into Europe. Same is happening with Asia now. Right? There is no sector, or the very few sectors, more committed to the Asian market than Hollywood. In the latest round of releases of big bucks Hollywood movies, the Asian viewing figures and revenue flows were greater than the North American revenue flows in the first week, the all-important first week release. The big blockbuster action films, which are all these weird, I don't watch them because seem like they're for 12-year-olds, but these sort of robot-type films, which are explicit, designed with minimal text, with minimal language, with minimal translatable elements, are actually being driven by the demand of the Asian market. And that, I think, is another very interesting element in which, as it were, what we might think of as American soft power diffuses in a way which is very potent. It remains an incredibly potent artifact. It's centered on the network of money and cultural production in the United States. It remains labeled American, but it, a bit like the iPhone, is a co-production of a very complex network. And I think that for me points to how even in this respect we're at a sort of tipping point. It's not clear that American demand is any longer what drives Hollywood's vision, or at least a big part of Hollywood's business model. And when that happens, the soft power equation is beginning to shift.
Well, se non ci sono altre domande, I think let me just notice this question of, the last question that has been posed, question of cultural or ideological narrative of power politics and in its combination with power politics in the international history of the 20th century has always been there, actually. It was always been combined with basically power politics narrative of Cold War. And in fact, for instance, Dr. Strangelove didn't believe in ideology, actually. That is to say, Stanley Kubrick didn't believe in ideology. He believed much more in power politics and economic power and so on. However, the narrative of the Cold War as a competition between different ideas of civilization, so to say, was very powerful up to some point. And again, I mean, the challenge of the Soviet Union, as far as I understand it, was taken seriously by the United States much more on this level than on the level of economic power. It was taken seriously on the level of warfare, of course. But here again, we have a periodization taking us back to understand what changed in the 1970s, 1980s. I don't know if you agree with this. Your accent fell very much on the persistence, much more than on discontinuity. Although, again, some transformation may have taken place in the 1970s, 1980s, if we assume, at least in part, the narrative of internationalism, ideology, and civilizational alternatives. I don't know if you agree with this. My question would be, you said China now is an alternative. Mm-hmm. I understand your argument in terms of the first challenge to American economic power ever, actually.
The first potential military challenge.
And military challenge, combined with economic power. Yeah. I mean, do you see other meanings in these Chinese alternatives today?
I think that takes us to a really fundamental set of questions which are very topical right now because people are trying to make sense of the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, and which is obviously right now, and one way I think the easiest way to respond to you would be to say, okay, China has emerged as an economic contender of an unprecedented scale, and on the back of that is also emerging as a military contender, but it doesn't pose the historic challenge in ideological terms that the Soviet Union did, or of course that Maoism did in the 60s and early 70s when Maoism was an independent vector of very important, and obviously in the crucial setbacks to American power in East Asia. I mean, America didn't win a single one of its East Asian Cold War conflicts. It fought to a stalemate in Korea and it fought to a defeat in Vietnam, and in both cases it was defeated by Chinese-backed opposition. But did that not die, I think is the question, right? Yeah. So to that extent and this is where then the historical analogies go towards Imperial Germany and and Edwardian Britain. So people think of the Chinese-American confrontation as being like 1914, devoid of ideology, but a more direct challenge. Now, I understand the force of that, and obviously it would be absurd to say that revolutionary Maoism was a powerful global force at this moment. It did spawn several difficult subversive movements. The Naxalite struggle in India is ongoing. Obviously in Peru until the 90s it was a bloody contest. So Maoism died a slow death. It died a slower death than Soviet communism did. But don't you think that we actually have to then shift the terrain to saying, okay, or what if we have to take seriously the ideological dimension, which doesn't consist in the communism or the Maoism, but consists in the truly supercharged mission to restore China's greatness. And China's greatness is a demanding thing. It's not like European greatness. It's a much more demanding aspiration than that. And the Communist Party, as it were, having at no point relinquished its communist commitment, as empty as it may seem now, but at no point having relinquished it, having bloodily demonstrated its willingness in 1989 to impose its rule, having engineered the greatest success in economic development ever achieved by any large group of humans, and this is the largest group of humans, that constitutes an ideology that we have to reckon with. And has to be taken seriously, not in the sense that it can be thought of as analogous to the Soviet Union or analogous to an expansive revolutionary Marxism that Maoism once embodied, but in the sort of twisted, subsumed, narrowed, but in no way defeated form that it's emerged. I mean, in no way have they lost. Why would any serious Chinese communist, obviously somebody who was committed to a revolutionary project of a visionary variety would say this was a disaster, as the Chinese New Left does. But if you cleave to the Communist Party as the organ of this power, you're living your dream. That is attractive. Yeah. And it has a potent appeal in lots of places which the West has failed to touch for decades in any effective way. And to me, the irony, though, is that, you have to say this, I think, to Americans who are always, the debunking of China's One Belt, One Road program is now a minor industry of its own right. It was started by a hawkish Indian strategic analyst 18 months ago. It's gone around the world so quickly, it's extraordinary. The receptivity of the world to an anti-Chinese, a Chinese neo-imperialist sort of analysis is electrifying. You can literally pinpoint the Project Syndicate essay with which a particular Indian hawkish strategic analysis launched this idea of debt imperialism, and bang, it's metastasized. My teenage daughter at high school wanted to write an essay about it within 6 months of this Project Syndicate essay coming out. It's absolutely extraordinary how quickly it's filtered through. But the reason why the One Belt, One Road program has the attractiveness that it does is that it offers an ideology of development. It offers an ideology of what the Germans would call Machbarkeit, the possibility of doing things. Ja, wir schaffen das. Yes, if you're Pakistan, you can get rich. No, we are not simply going to abandon you to counterinsurgency. When we look at Pakistan, we don't see the Swat Valley. What we see is a gigantic coal field and then an opened highway of travel and transport and trade, and that's what we're going to build, right? And the contrast between the American and the Chinese visions of Pakistan is stark. Now, does that constitute an exportable model? Of course, I think it's almost an absurd question, because the success of the Chinese model is so deeply entangled precisely with this entire history. All those anguished Italian histories of the Italian left and its involution of what's left. Imagine that writ 20 times larger with an outcome which, at least in some sense, is ambiguously positive. No, they did seize power, they maintained power by all means necessary, and they've delivered this. But that is not something that you can then say to the Pakistanis, well, have our development model, because they don't have a one-party state. They don't have a revolutionary experience. They haven't had collectivization. None of this ever happened. So in some sense, their model is vastly more demanding than anything the West has ever tried to export. Because we said pluralism, modernization theory, a little bit of more communication, some industrial growth, a couple of dams, and you're away, right? The Chinese give you all that infrastructure, but their own history has this incredible, entangled, ideological and yet deeply de-ideologized entire history, right? Compressed. So it's a hugely open question, but the one thing I think that requires, especially historians and historians interested in the Cold War, I think should surely have a function in resisting the story which says the Cold War ended in 1989. Yeah. What happens in China after that is just capitalism. It's just surrender. There's nothing distinctive about it. It's just the subordination of China to a global growth dynamic. As a liberal, I wish that were true. It clearly isn't. What we're confronting is something much more complex, much, much more historically path-dependent, and indelibly associated with what was once a fully ideological project, and never one that, so we need a new category, like ideological projects which didn't surrender and yet morphed and yet won. And that's an amalgam that's unique.
Ok, credo che dobbiamo ringraziare molto il professor Adam Tooze per la sua lecture di oggi. Abbiamo imparato molto, è stato un dibattito molto interessante. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you for your patience.
Really interesting.
Good.